St. Thomas Aquinas was surprisingly popular in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines had not tried really to read much of the writings of the Western fathers because they didn't learn Latin and they weren't particularly bothered to have their writings translated into Greek, and the West was thought of as a sort of barbarian wasteland full of illiterate, weird people, and so they never really occurred to them that there was any reason to be interested in what they had to say. Though of course they did liturgically venerate the Western fathers. Gregory the Great was an exception to this in that he was translated into Greek during his lifetime, partly perhaps because he was the papal ambassador to Constantinople, and partly because Rome was incorporated into the empire focused on Constantinople at that time. But in general, there was very widespread ignorance of, almost total ignorance of Western theological and philosophical culture. The Byzantines therefore didn't realize initially that the Westerners were developing rapidly, intellectually and institutionally, over the course of the 12th century, until they discovered with a shock the scale of Western military power with the sack of Constantinople in 1204. They then had their noses rubbed in that for the following 60 years or so, while the Crusaders inexpertly and ruled over Constantinople in the short-lived and unfortunate Latin Empire of Constantinople. So when Michael VIII reconquered Constantinople, there was finally a rather bad-humoured but genuine interest in what had happened to the Westerners and what they had to say. And slowly, great works of Western philosophy and theology started being, Western in the sense of Latin, started being translated into Greek. The Dominicans managed to maintain a house in the town of Galeta, which is across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. It's where the fortress which guards the chain blocking off the entrance into the harbour is maintained. And in the middle of the 14th century, the chief minister of the Byzantine Empire, a very important man called Demetrius Kydones, was asked by the Emperor John VI Cantacuzenos to learn Latin for diplomatic purposes. And so he went to the Dominicans and asked if they could instruct him in the language. The Dominicans did very well at this. Kydones was very talented, and rather cunningly they suggested that for the completion of his Latin lessons he should translate St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles into Greek, which he did, and he managed to finish this translation on Christmas Eve 1354, is that right? Yes. And so 99 years before the fall of the city of Constantinople to the Turks. And he was completely convinced by what he read in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And he soon after asked to be received into full communion with the Holy See. And he devoted himself to the work of trying to restore communion between Rome and Constantinople and end the Great Schism. Thomas Aquinas had a sort of preference for the Greek fathers. He disproportionately cites and quotes the Greek fathers, notably in his work, the Catena Aurea, which is a commentary taken from the writings of the fathers on the four Gospels, which is heavily skewed towards the Greek fathers. He famously said once, when he was finishing a long walk from southern Italy to Paris with another friar, and they caught their first sight of the city of Paris spread out before them, and the friar walking with him said, isn't it amazing? And St. Thomas said, I'd give all of it for just one copy of St. John Chrysostom's commentary on Matthew's Gospel, which is a famous illustration of his reverence for the Greek fathers. The Byzantines were very impressed with his synthesis of Aristotle's philosophy and the writings of the fathers, and for his perception of the unity of doctrine among all the fathers, both the Eastern and the Western fathers. So, ironically, Aquinas would have a more uncontested prestige among the Byzantines who were in schism in the East than he did in the West during the later Middle Ages, where he was certainly the most important of all the scholastic authorities, but was not uncontested, and his followers were fighting against many rival schools, not just the serious enemies of the Via Moderna, but also the other rival schools within the Via Antiqua. The work of Kydones and others led to the emergence of a Byzantine Thomism, and also greatly strengthened the unionist movement in the Byzantine Empire. This had already emerged during the initial Union of Lyon rather, which was brought about by the Emperor Michael VIII, and backed by the Patriarch John Beckus. But Beckus had perceived the unity of the Latin and Byzantine doctrine from entirely within the Byzantine tradition. He wasn't himself a student or a follower of the new Latin scholastic doctors, whereas Kydones was a follower of the Latin scholastic doctors. Now, the only thing that could resolve the Great Schism would be an ecumenical council. And it couldn't just be an ecumenical council like the Second Council of Lyon, where there was no real discussion with the Byzantine delegates. The Byzantine delegates were just 2 or 3 people, and they really just came in order to accept the position of the Latin theologians in order to avoid another Crusader attack on Constantinople. They didn't come there to genuinely find a consensus. A council that could really solve the Great Schism would have to be a truly ecumenical council with many, many, many delegates from the East as well as from the West. In fact, the Byzantines would have preferred for it to be a council in Constantinople, but unfortunately the advances of the Turks were so extensive by this point that Constantinople was surrounded on its European side as well as its Asian side by Turkish-controlled territory. Therefore, it was far too dangerous to attempt a large Latin delegation sailing to Constantinople. Therefore, the Byzantines reluctantly agreed to the idea of having a council in the west, but on the Adriatic coast of Italy, so as near to Byzantium as possible. Of course, this was rather difficult to arrange, given that there was a 3-way contest for the title of legitimate pope by this point at the end of the 14th century. However, this Great Western Schism also meant that the Westerners were preoccupied with the idea of having a council as well, because they thought that was the only way of resolving the dispute over who was the rightful pope. So that dispute would be resolved by the Ecumenical Council of Constance. This was held from 1414 to 1418, and although a very important council, has always been a rather problematic one in the Catholic tradition, because people despairing at the dispute between the 3 popes, many of them had fallen into an ecclesiological error called conciliarism, which holds to the superiority of an ecumenical council over the pope. Now, this is not really possible, because an ecumenical council is only truly and legitimately an ecumenical council because the pope presides over it through his legates and ultimately confirms it at the end of its proceedings. So it only really is an ecumenical council together with the Pope, so it can't be above the Pope. And the idea that it could be ultimately strikes at the visibility of the Church, because it makes it impossible. If you had 2 rival councils, you wouldn't be able to know which one was the rightful council, because they could, in theory, confirm 2 different popes, and therefore you would have a schism that really couldn't be solved. But the idea of resolving it bypassed the conciliarist issue. The idea is that the Pisan line of popes, which at that point was represented by Pope John the 23rd, not the one who summoned the Ecumenical Council, the Second Vatican Council, but a pseudo John the 23rd, because his line was not the true line. The Roman line was the true line. Most people had abandoned Avignon by this point, so the 2 main lines that were supported were Rome and Pisa. So the Pope, the Roman Pope was Pope Gregory XII, and so he agreed that both he and the Pisan Pope, John the 23rd, would summon an ecumenical council, the same ecumenical council, and then they would both abdicate after after they had empowered that council to elect their successor. And this would get around the problem of having two different colleges of cardinals, and it would bring the schism to an end. Now, in the end, John the 23rd changed his mind and tried to revoke his abdication, and the Council of Constance, which had been summoned to elect a new pope, lost its temper and imprisoned John the 23rd for doing this and declared him deposed. So although the idea was quite a nice one, in the end, it's only if the Roman line of popes was legitimate that the papal line continued successfully through the schism. Fortunately, of course, or providentially, the Roman line of popes was legitimate. All this occurred in the year the election of the new pope occurred in the year 1417, and the new pope who was elected was Pope Martin V. Before that, Constance had issued a number of documents, some of which actually sort of canonized the conciliarist heresy or error, as it was at that point. Fortunately, Pope Martin V didn't confirm any of the unorthodox sessions of Constance, but he did confirm the rule that there had to be frequently recurring ecumenical councils. Now, this rule would not actually survive very long, but it did mean that Martin V had to summon another council soon after the Council of Constance. Otherwise, there would have been a great uproar across Europe about the disobedience of the Pope to the council, which had ended the Great Western Schism. So after a couple of false starts, shortly before he died, Martin V summoned an ecumenical council to the Swiss town of Basel. There was also a lot of enthusiasm for having councils outside of Italy because it was thought that it was sort of Italian fractiousness and endless scheming which had led to the schism, and so the German speakers were keen to have a council in their own territory, which is why Constance was held where it was, and why Basel was summoned to where it was. But Martin V died almost immediately after summoning the council, so the council would be held under his successor, Pope Eugene IV. By this point, discussions with the Byzantines had reached an advanced stage, and the Byzantines were pressuring for the council to be moved to the Adriatic coast of Italy. One interesting feature of the Council of Constance was that great prominence was given at it to the English. The reason why is because the English had apparently won the 100 Years' War at this point. With the Battle of Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415, the King of England, King Henry V, prevailed over the French army, which had vastly outnumbered him and which he massacred a huge proportion of, and was acknowledged as the heir to the French throne by the King of France. So it looked as if the new superpower in Europe was going to be the united monarchy of England and France. In fact, this never came to pass because God didn't want it to happen. So St. Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret of Antioch appeared to a young French peasant girl in Lorraine, Jeanne d'Arc, and instructed her to go and find the heir to the Valois line of French kings and tell him to put her at the command of his armies, which he did somewhat shockedly. We don't know what she said to him, but apparently something which only God and the king himself could have known was revealed to Joan of Arc, and she communicated this secret to the French king in order to show that she was genuinely God's messenger, and she managed to relieve the siege of Orléans, preventing the total dominance of France above the Loire by the English, and then to conduct the French armies to the traditional coronation site of Reims, where the French king was able to be crowned, whereas the English claimant to the French throne, Henry V's son, Henry VI, was only able to be crowned in Paris, which was not the traditional location for French coronations. In the end, Joan of Arc would be captured by the English and burnt at the stake notoriously, despite the fact that she'd appealed to the Pope against her conviction for heresy, which was a jumped-up charge designed to get rid of her, appeals to the Pope automatically suspend all legal proceedings, but the English and French collaborating judges ignored this principle and carried on with the trial and burnt Saint Joan at the stake. The verdict was therefore later overthrown by the Pope, and of course eventually in the 1920s Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint. The council in Basel was told by Pope Eugene IV that it couldn't stay in Basel because it was more important to end the Great Schism with the East than it was to please the preferences of the delegates at Basel. And the Byzantines were only willing to have a council on the Adriatic coast of Italy. The bishops and others at Basel refused to accept this, or only a minority of them accepted it. So those who did accept it moved to Ferrara, which was the location agreed with the Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, the Byzantine Emperor, for the reunion council. But the remaining ones, the majority of the bishops and other delegates, at this point things were becoming a bit vague as to who was entitled to sit at a council. They stayed in Basel, which was actually very convenient for the popes because it meant their most inveterate opponents, the ones who were most committed to conciliarism, didn't come to the ecumenical council. They were in this anti-council in Basel. The 700 Byzantine delegates arrived in Ferrara, the Emperor Michael VIII himself in person, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and proctors for all the other Eastern Greek patriarchs, as well as many other delegates. And discussions commenced on the filioque, on the legitimacy of altering the creed, on purgatory, on the nature of papal authority. So very wide-ranging and very detailed discussions. In the end, the council had to be moved from Ferrara to Florence because of an outbreak of plague in Ferrara, and the famous bankers of Florence were paying for the whole thing with loans to the Pope. Eventually, the Byzantine delegates accepted the doctrine of the filioque. The argument which clinched things for them was that many Eastern fathers had said things which seemed to support the filioque, but the opponents of union had ways of interpreting these Greek fathers so as to exclude the idea of them supporting the filioque. But the proponents of union among the Byzantines were able to interpret it differently, if more naturally indeed, as being in favour of the filioque. But what even the opponents of union in the East couldn't do was interpret the Western fathers as denying the filioque. And the problem this raised for the opponents of reunion was that if their interpretation of the Eastern Fathers was adopted, it would mean that the Eastern and Western Fathers had always disagreed and that there wasn't a common doctrine of the Trinity across all the Fathers of the Church. But the Western Fathers are also venerated in the Byzantine liturgy. So if the Eastern anti-Unionists were to accuse adherents of the filioque of heresy, they would have to accuse the Western Fathers of the Church of heresy, and therefore their own forebears of having liturgically venerated for 1,000 years heretics. So essentially there was no way round that argument. Every single Byzantine delegate ultimately accepted that the true common doctrine of the Church was that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, and that the difference between the expression "and the Son" and "through the Son" really merely reflected a linguistic variation between Eastern and Western usage, not any substantive doctrinal disagreement. Only one Byzantine delegate refused to accept this, a man called Mark of Ephesus, and he didn't even claim that he didn't have any way of answering the argument about the fathers of the Church. He had to claim that every single writing of a Western father that supported the filioque was a forgery, which was an obviously absurd conspiracy theory, which would be quite impossible to achieve a forgery on that scale. As one of the Byzantine delegates pointed out to him in frustration, but Mark of Ephesus left Florence before the council concluded and managed to get back to Constantinople, where he set himself up as the principal opponent of the reunion. But the reunion was agreed by the Patriarch and the Emperor and the delegates of the other patriarchs and the other Byzantine delegates, and the great document Letentor Caeli, establishing the doctrine of the Church on all these topics, was agreed, the text in both Greek and Latin, and it was solemnly proclaimed by Bessarion, Bishop of Nicaea, and Cardinal Giuliano Cesarini from the west door of the cathedral in Florence, in the presence of the Emperor and the Pope. And very significantly, in that bull, the Byzantine Emperor is once again, for the first time since the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, described in a papal document as Emperor of the Romans, clinching the reconciliation of East and West. And many of those present wept, and church bells were rung throughout Western Christendom to celebrate this great moment. And the conciliarist movement received a very serious blow, because in order to deny, if they denied the legitimacy of the Council of Florence, they would be denying the legitimacy of this great reunion. However, unfortunately, despite the fact that the remaining emperors, John VIII and his brother Constantine XI in Constantinople, and the remaining patriarchs in Constantinople were Catholics, and despite the fact that the reunion itself was proclaimed in the Hagia Sophia on the 12th of December 1452 by Bishop Isidore of Kiev, who by that time had been also appointed papal legate, unfortunately the Turkish ring of steel had completed its encirclement of Constantinople. The King of Poland, Władysław III, who was also King of Hungary, led a great crusade along with Cardinal Cesarini to try and rescue Constantinople, but the Venetians failed in their undertaking to blockade the Bosphorus and prevent the second half of the Turkish army uniting with the western half, and the King of Poland and the Cardinal died in the battle, and their bodies were never found. As a result, the Emperor, Constantine XI, was left with very little help to defend his city against the forces of Islam. The Turkish Sultan, Mehmed II, offered Constantine a deal whereby the entire Christian population of Constantinople would leave the city, evacuate it of everything, hand it over for its churches to be turned into mosques, and its palaces and houses and streets to be occupied by the Turks, and move to southern Greece, where the emperor would be allowed to serve as Turkish governor of the Peloponnese and rule over his exiled people for the remainder of his life. But Constantine refused to surrender the Queen of Cities to the armies of Islam, and therefore it was subjected to siege and ultimately to brutal sack. The Hagia Sophia seized and turned into a mosque on the Tuesday, the 29th of May, 1453. The Emperor Constantine, when he realized that all was lost, he charged into the melee at the San Romanos gate, and his body was never found. Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate, when he saw that the city had fallen, he removed his clothes and placed them on the body of a corpse, and he took the corpse's clothes and wore them himself. And so the Turks mistakenly thought that Isidore of Kiev had been killed in the sack of the city, and that the person who really was Isidore of Kiev they assumed was just a commoner, so they sold him into slavery. Isidore was able to escape from slavery and return to Italy, where he and then Bessarion, later Bessarion of Nicaea, would be appointed as the Catholic patriarchs of Constantinople by the Pope. Unfortunately, Mehmed, who realized that if the Union of Florence persisted, there was a danger of another crusade coming to try and liberate Constantinople, he appointed as the Turkish-backed Patriarch of Constantinople the leader of the opponents of the reunion, Gennadios Scholarios, who had in fact been in favour of the union at the council, but had subsequently been won over to the side of Mark of Ephesus in the following years. And it's from those two lines, Isidore of Kiev and Gennadios Scholarios, that the modern Greek Catholic Church and Orthodox Church are derived. one of the great opponents of the reunion was Muscovy, the Principality of Muscovy, which was the easternmost fragment of the Principality of Kiev, which was destroyed by Mongol invasion in the 13th century. The Muscovites had long been itching to declare ecclesiastical independence from Constantinople, and they used the reunion as an excuse to repudiate the authority of the patriarch there. And when the city was captured, they continued in this position, now accepting the Ottoman patriarchs, but treating their ruler as the new leader of the Eastern Christian world, and eventually giving him the title Tsar, which is derived from the name Caesar, so essentially a claim to be the new Byzantine emperor. Another great development of the 15th century was the completion of the Reconquista, the 700-year-long war to reconquer Spain from Islam. And Spain would become in the 16th century a sort of military and cultural and intellectual center for the Catholic Church, because everything that the Middle Ages tried to accomplish prevailed in Spain, whereas much of it was failing elsewhere in Europe. The three main kingdoms in Spain, ignoring Navarre, which was in the far north of Spain, the three main kingdoms in Spain, by which I mean the Iberian Peninsula, which in those days was all called Hispania, and these were Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. The royal line of Castile was ending at the end of the 15th century in a female, a very remarkable female, Isabella of Castile. And so she was a great prize, not only because she was a wonderful woman, all saintly and vigorous figure, but also because whoever married her would end up ruling over Castile, which was the largest of the three kingdoms. In the end, she chose to marry Ferdinand of Aragon, and therefore the Kingdom of Aragon and the Kingdom of Castile were united, and thereafter were referred to as the Kingdom of Spain. In fact, institutionally they remained two kingdoms, but they had one king from that point onwards, initially ruled by Isabella and Ferdinand, and then by their successors. They were able to drive out the last remaining Islamic power from the south of Spain and complete the reconquest of the peninsula in the year 1492, which of course was also the year in which Isabella funded Christopher Columbus to attempt to reach China or India by sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore inadvertently to discover that there was two other large continents in the way, although he probably didn't realize that until shortly before his death. He thought that he discovered India, but the conquest of the Indies is a subject which we'll have to discuss when we're looking at the 16th century. Unfortunately, after the Council of Florence, the papacy descended into another period of corruption, made worse by the sort of neo-pagan enthusiasm of the Renaissance. But a movement was already developing against this corruption to try and renew the church, and this movement was also centered on Florence and led by the great Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who essentially transformed the center of neo-pagan Renaissance culture into a kind of monastery republic for a few brief years, while his sermons so influenced the people that the entire city was dominated by those who followed him. Unfortunately, he fell into serious conflict with the notoriously corrupt Pope Alexander VI Borgia, and eventually this conflict was weaponized by his enemies within Florence and led to his unjust execution by burning at the stake by agents of his opponents in Florence and of Alexander VI Borgia. Perhaps if that hadn't happened, the Catholic Reformation would have happened before the Protestant Reformation and forestalled it, but it didn't. And so in the Protestant Reformation, the Via Moderna would become weaponized into a completely rival theological vision, which would create the greatest single division in the entire history of Western Christianity.